June 1942. The Pacific trembled under the weight of war. The Empire of Japan stretched from the shores of Burma to the jungles of New Guinea. Their carriers ruled the sea. Their pilots owned the sky. And America, bruised, bleeding, outnumbered, was in retreat. But from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, 3 carriers slipped into the ocean: Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown. They carried no guarantees, only a broken code, a daring plan, and men prepared to vanish into fire. In 3 days, everything would change. Not through strength, but through 5 minutes of chaos, courage, and fate. This is not a story of victory. It is a story of survival, of a moment when history cracked and the tide began to turn. The Pacific was bleeding. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire was on a path that looked unstoppable. They had swept across the Pacific with terrifying speed, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. American forces had been beaten back, island after island, outgunned and outmaneuvered. To many, the Pacific War was already lost. The rising sun stretched from Burma to the Solomons, casting a long shadow across the ocean. And yet, the center of that shadow was hollow. For all their victories, the Japanese had missed one vital target on December 7th, the American aircraft carriers. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. All 3 had been at sea when the attack came, and they would soon become more than warships. They would become ghosts, weapons of revenge, moving, vanishing, and striking without warning. The first warning came on April 18th, 1942. From the deck of the USS Hornet, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, never designed for carrier takeoffs, launched into the unknown. Their target was Tokyo. The Doolittle raid, as it came to be known, did little damage to Japan's industrial base, but it shook the soul of the empire. American bombs fell on the capital itself. For the first time in the war, Japanese civilians looked to the sky in fear. It was a slap in the face to a military machine that had only known domination. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man behind Pearl Harbor, understood the deeper threat. The raid hadn't just humiliated the high command. It had exposed a weakness. If the Americans could strike Tokyo, even symbolically, they could shake morale. They could slow expansion. They could change the course of the war. So Yamamoto devised a plan. Not just a counterattack, a trap. His idea was to lure the remaining American carriers into open waters and destroy them all at once. The chosen bait, a tiny coral atoll called Midway. Midway lay just over 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. Its strategic value was obvious. It was the forward edge of America's Pacific defense. Take it, and Japan could threaten Pearl Harbor again. But more importantly, Yamamoto believed America would not let it go without a fight. He planned a feint toward the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north, while his main carrier force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway from the west, crush its defenses, and prepare to ambush the American fleet when it arrived. It was bold, precise, perfect on paper. But in Hawaii, something had already begun to unravel it. Inside a low, windowless building at Pearl Harbor Naval Station, a team of Navy cryptanalysts worked around the clock. They were known simply as Station Hypo, led by the brilliant and eccentric commander Joseph Rochefort. They had been working for months to crack Japan's JN-25 Naval code. And in May 1942, they began intercepting messages referring to a target labeled only as AF. Rochefort suspected AF was Midway, but Washington was unsure. So, Rochefort proposed a test. The Americans instructed Midway to send out an uncoded message reporting that its water distillation plant had failed. 2 days later, a Japanese message, encrypted, was intercepted. AF is short on water. Now they knew. The Japanese were coming for Midway. Armed with that knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, made a decision that would alter the war. He would beat Yamamoto to the punch. While the Japanese believed the American fleet would arrive late or not at all, Nimitz ordered the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to steam for Midway immediately. He reinforced the island with every available aircraft and pilot, even old flying boats and patched-up bombers. And he gave command of the carrier task force to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance in tactical control. It was a race against time, and against logic. The Americans would be outnumbered. The Japanese had more ships, more planes, more experience, but the US would have one thing the Japanese no longer did: the element of surprise. As May turned to June, sailors loaded torpedoes. Deck crews refueled planes under cover of darkness. Ground crews on Midway dug deeper, reinforced bunkers, and waited for what they knew was coming. They did not know the scale of it. They did not know that within days, the largest carrier battle in history would unfold in the skies above them. And they certainly didn't know that the fate of the Pacific War would hinge not on power, but on timing, courage, and a few fateful decisions made by men who had never seen battle before. The storm was coming, and Midway would be its eye. Before the bombs fell, before the dive bombers screamed through the clouds, before the carriers even sighted each other, there was silence. Not the silence of peace, but of hidden war. A war of numbers, of signals, of men hunched over desks, staring into streams of encrypted Japanese text. And in a quiet basement at Pearl Harbor, this war was being won by a group of American cryptanalysts most people in the Navy had never heard of. They were called Station Hypo, and their leader was Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort didn't wear polished boots or crisp uniforms. He wore a bathrobe and slippers. He spoke in riddles, quoted Shakespeare, and refused publicity, but his mind was sharper than any admiral's sword. And in the weeks before Midway, he would prove it. The Japanese Navy communicated using a complex cipher system known as JN-25, built from code books, additive tables, and radio discipline. Every operation, every fleet movement, every logistics request was masked behind layers of numbers. But no code is perfect, and every system leaves cracks. Rochefort's team had been grinding away at JN-25 since 1941, piecing together fragments, cross-referencing call signs, cataloging the habits of Japanese radio operators. By early May 1942, they were intercepting a repeated reference to a target known only as AF. The problem was no one knew what AF was. Some believed it might be Port Moresby. Others thought it could be the Aleutians. Rochefort, based on analysis and instinct, was convinced. AF was Midway. But Washington wasn't so sure, and war, by nature, demands certainty. So Rochefort devised a test, simple and brilliant. He instructed the garrison on Midway to send out an uncoded message. Their water purification system had failed, and they were short on fresh water. The message was broadcast openly, knowing full well Japanese intelligence would be listening. 2 days later, a Japanese transmission was intercepted and decrypted. It stated that AF is short on water. That was it. The trap had been revealed. With confirmation in hand, Admiral Nimitz took action. He began moving his limited carrier force to a position northeast of Midway before the Japanese could arrive. But he didn't tell anyone outside his circle how he knew what was coming. The deception had to remain secret. Even some within the US military refused to believe the intelligence. There were high-ranking officers in Washington who doubted Rochefort, who believed the fleet should remain near Pearl Harbor, who feared sending 3 carriers into a trap of Japan's own making. They argued. They hesitated. But Nimitz didn't. He had seen enough. He trusted Rochefort, even if Washington didn't. And in that act of trust, he changed the future of the Pacific War. The Enterprise and Hornet left port first. Their decks buzzed with activity, sailors whispering about a major strike, though few knew where they were headed. Some believed they were sailing to their deaths. Behind them came the Yorktown, still bruised from Coral Sea, its hull warped, its flight deck battered. It had been struck by a bomb, torpedoed, and hastily repaired in just 72 hours. It shouldn't have sailed again, but it did. It had to. The 3 American carriers slipped across the Pacific in radio silence, carrying torpedoes, dive bombers, and men who would either write history or vanish into it. Back at Station Hypo, Rochefort's team continued to listen. They tracked fleet movements, deciphered last-minute weather reports, confirmed the Japanese timeline. The amount of detail they provided was staggering. Attack direction, date, time. But when the battle ended, no medals came, no headlines. Rochefort's role remained classified. Some in Washington resented him. He would be reassigned within months, pushed into silence. It was one of the greatest intelligence victories in American history, and it allowed a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor to take the first step toward turning the tide. By the end of May 1942, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the patched-up Yorktown, were steaming east of Midway, hidden in a vast ocean. Their decks were crowded with aircraft, their fuel bunkers full, their crews tense. Every man aboard knew the stakes. The trap was set, but they weren't the only ones moving. The Japanese fleet, under Admiral Nagumo, advanced with surgical precision. 4 elite carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed as the spearhead. Escorting them, 2 battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. Thousands of men, hundreds of planes, every ship a moving weapon. But they were sailing blind. They believed the American carriers were still near Pearl Harbor. Their timing, their attack plans, their confidence, all built on that assumption. It was their greatest vulnerability, and they didn't know it. On Midway Atoll, every spare moment was spent digging, repairing, reinforcing. The island was barely more than 2 strips of coral and sand with a runway, a few scattered buildings, and hastily emplaced anti-aircraft guns. Marines dug into the rock, working alongside Navy and Army Air Corps units. Their aircraft were a patchwork: B-17S, Catalina flying boats, TBD Devastators, F-4F Wildcats, and the aging Brewster Buffaloes. Most pilots had never flown in combat, and yet they were ready. On the morning of June 3rd, a Catalina patrol plane spotted the first signs, a Japanese transport group west of Midway. The alarm was raised, bombers scrambled, but the real threat, the carriers, remained hidden. That night, aboard the U.S. carriers, pilots slept beside their aircraft. Deck crews secured bombs. Chaplains moved quietly between men. The ocean was calm, the sky clear, but beneath the silence, every man knew that tomorrow would bring something different, something final. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, the Japanese carriers launched their first wave, over 100 aircraft roaring toward Midway. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, Zeros. They struck the island with fury. Fuel tanks exploded, hangars burned. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with flak, but Midway held. The airstrip remained usable. Ground crews kept fighting. Pilots who survived scrambled again for follow-up sorties. Midway had not broken. From the Japanese flight crews came a request. Midway must be struck again. Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had held back a reserve strike group for anti-ship operations, armed with torpedoes. Now, to strike Midway again, those planes had to be rearmed with bombs. Below deck, his crews began a dangerous process. Unloading torpedoes, refitting aircraft, changing plans. It was chaos, and it took time. Meanwhile, American scout planes spotted the Japanese fleet. The message was sent. Enemy carriers sighted bearing 320, distance 180. The order went out. From the decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, American aircraft began to launch. Squadrons rose into the sky in scattered formations. Many had incomplete coordinates. Some couldn't locate their targets. Others broke formation, never to return. First came the torpedo squadrons, slow, underdefended, courageous to the end. Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, flying from Hornet, pressed its attack head-on. Every one of the 15 Devastator bombers was shot down. Only one man survived, Ensign George Gay. He floated alone for hours, hidden under a seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. VT-6 and VT-3 met the same fate. Dozens of aircraft, almost every pilot lost. But their sacrifice had a cost, not to themselves, but to the enemy. The Japanese fighter cover had followed the torpedo squadrons down low. In those crucial moments, their carriers were left unprotected above. At 10:22 a.m., the U.S. dive bombers arrived. Pilots from Enterprise and Yorktown, led by Commander Wade McCluskey, had nearly turned back, low on fuel, unsure of direction. Then McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer moving at high speed. He followed it. It led him straight to the carriers. The dive bombers split into groups. Some dove on Kaga, others targeted Akagi. In the chaos, Soryu was also struck, and in under 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. Flames erupted from flight decks filled with fuel and munitions. Aircraft still being armed below exploded. Crews leapt overboard into oil-covered seas. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was unraveling in front of them. And George Gay, still floating alone, saw it all. But the battle was not over. Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, had not yet launched her strike, and she was about to respond. Smoke towered into the Pacific sky. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning wrecks. Their flight decks shredded. Their hangars filled with flame and twisted metal. The sea around them boiled with fuel and floating debris. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had tasted disaster. But one ship still stood untouched, Hiryu, fast, agile, and deadly. On her bridge, Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi remained calm. His face betrayed no emotion as word of the losses arrived. The enemy had struck first, but not completely. Hiryu still had her full air group, and Yamaguchi wasn't going to retreat. He was going to strike back. At 10:54 a.m., just minutes after the devastation of his sister carriers, Hiryu launched her first counterattack. 18 dive bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros, with orders to find and destroy the U.S. carriers. They found Yorktown. Still recovering aircraft from its own earlier strike, Yorktown looked calm. Her crew had settled into a tense rhythm, but radar picked up the incoming threat, and in moments, the calm shattered. General quarters sounded, guns manned, bombs fell. 2 direct hits and a near miss tore through Yorktown's deck. Fires broke out. Power systems failed. Crewmen scrambled through smoke-filled corridors to patch ruptured pipes, douse flames, and evacuate the wounded. But Yorktown didn't die. Within an hour, damage control crews, trained, experienced, and almost miraculously composed, had restored partial power. The ship was still afloat. The fires were out. Planes were landing again. Then came Hiryu's second wave. This time, torpedo bombers. Approaching low over the waves, they dodged anti-aircraft fire and closed the distance. Yorktown maneuvered desperately, but 2 torpedoes struck her starboard side. The hull groaned. Water flooded compartments. The ship lost propulsion and began listing heavily. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Men climbed over rails, slid down ropes, jumped into oily water. Destroyers moved in to pick them up. And still, Yorktown didn't sink. She floated, wounded but defiant, as the battle raged on. Meanwhile, American scouts had located Hiryu. Enterprise launched a final wave of dive bombers that afternoon. The pilots, many of them low on fuel, braved flak and enemy fighters to make their run. At 5 p.m., they struck. 4 direct hits. Fires engulfed Hiryu's flight deck. Explosions rippled through her hangars. Aircraft were incinerated before they could be launched. Crew members fought to save her, but it was no use. That night, Yamaguchi offered evacuation, chose to remain aboard. As flames consumed the Hiryu, he and his captain stood on deck, hands folded behind their backs, staring into the fire. They went down with their ship. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone. The heart of Japan's naval air power, its best pilots, aircraft, and command, had been annihilated in a single day. The cost was high. Over 300 American airmen were dead or missing. Yorktown, though still afloat, had been mortally wounded. But the momentum of the war had changed. In just 5 minutes, dive bombers turned history on its head. In a few decisive strikes, the United States Navy had done what once seemed impossible. They had stopped the Japanese advance cold. The Pacific no longer belonged to the rising sun. The sun had dipped low over the Pacific. The horizon glowed orange as the sea boiled with wreckage and fire. Aircraft drifted in pieces. Oil slicks stretched for miles, and below the waterline, the torpedoes of silent hunters circled like sharks. Hiryu, once the last hope of the Japanese strike force, was now a crippled ruin. Her decks were scorched. Her engines failed. The flames reached into her command tower as sailors fought a hopeless battle to save her. Admiral Yamaguchi, aware that rescue would compromise the fleet, made a decision both revered and tragic. He gathered his remaining officers, stood tall in his dress uniform, and refused evacuation. As dawn approached, he and Captain Kaku Tomeya went down with their ship, eyes fixed on the burning sky. To the Japanese fleet, the defeat was unthinkable. To the Americans, it was not yet a victory. Yorktown, though still afloat after the double blow from Hiryu's counterattack, was bleeding internally. She listed hard to port. Her hull groaned as compartments filled with seawater. She drifted, silent, vulnerable, and wounded. But she was not alone. The destroyer USS Haman came alongside, transferring damage control crews and equipment. Pontoons were rigged, pumps activated, fire snuffed out. Against all odds, she began to stabilize. Then, from below, the unseen threat arrived. At 1:36 p.m. on June 6th, as salvage operations continued, the Japanese submarine Y-168 crept into range. In a single silent launch, 4 torpedoes sliced through the water. One struck Haman midships, ripping her in half. 2 others slammed into Yorktown, tearing into the already compromised hull. The Haman sank in minutes. Her depth charges detonated as she went down, killing scores of sailors in the water. Oil, metal, and blood floated across the waves. Yorktown, this time, could not be saved. She remained upright through the night, her flag still flying, but by the morning of June 7th, she finally rolled and slipped beneath the surface. She took with her 141 men. Of the Japanese force, the losses were catastrophic. 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, over 3,000 sailors and aircrew, including some of Japan's most elite pilots. More than machines, these were the irreplaceable assets of Japan's naval strength, Men who had trained for years, who had flown over China, who had bombed Pearl Harbor, were now gone. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked the industrial base and pilot training reserves to absorb such a loss. In Tokyo, the news was delayed, then softened, then buried. The Japanese public would not learn the full scale of the defeat for months. In Washington, there were no parades, no triumphal headlines. The victory was real, but the war was far from over. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the man who had believed in Rochefort's intelligence and rolled the dice on Midway, summarized it best. Midway was the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. But beneath that triumph lay hundreds of grieving families. Pilots who never returned, sailors whose ships never came home, men buried in ocean graves, unmarked, unseen, eternal. The Battle of Midway was over, but its echoes would stretch across the ocean for years to come. On June 7, 1942, the survivors returned to Midway's battered runways, to carrier decks littered with fuel hoses and spent shell casings, to destroyer decks lined with oil-soaked men trembling from shock and salt water. They had stopped an empire. But in the silence that followed, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. The Enterprise limped home, planes chained down in silence. The Hornet returned battered but intact. The Yorktown was gone. The Haman, gone. Hundreds of men, pilots, mechanics, sailors, gone. The air smelled of oil and iron, and the ocean would not give them back. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team quietly packed up their notes. They had won one of the greatest intelligence battles in history, yet there would be no medals, no fanfare. Rochefort was removed from his post and reassigned. His victory would remain classified, buried beneath layers of secrecy and politics. But without him, there would have been no ambush, no edge, no chance. Midway was not a miracle. It was a gamble, based on broken codes, trust in invisible data, and the courage of men who chose to act before all the facts were in. It was a lesson in risk, in silence, and in sacrifice. For Japan, the loss was crippling. Their four best carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were irreplaceable. The elite pilots who had trained for years, who had led the assault on Pearl Harbor, were gone. And unlike the United States, Japan could not rebuild them fast enough. From that point forward, the Japanese Navy would be on the defensive. Every battle after Midway, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Philippines, would be fought with less, fewer carriers, fewer planes, fewer pilots. The expansion had stopped, the tide had turned. But the war was far from over. More islands would burn, more ships would sink. The Pacific would become a graveyard of iron and ambition. But at Midway, something fundamental had changed. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. The United States had shown that it could stand toe-to-toe with the Empire of Japan and win. Not with overwhelming force, not with superior technology, but with timing, intelligence, and raw, unrelenting courage. The Pacific didn't turn in a single moment. It turned in choices. Some made in darkness, others made under fire. It turned in the smoke rising from a dive bomber's strike, in the silence of a codebreaker's gamble, in the floating body of a torpedo squadron that never came back. Midway was not just a battle, it was the hinge of the Pacific War. And from that hinge, the world would swing in a new direction.